Okay, here we go with Digestive System 3, and what we're going to talk in this video is basically after the stomach. Now we're talking the small intestine and the large intestine, and that'll be enough for this particular video PowerPoint. So let's start to talk a little bit about the intestine. One thing I did want to show you here is this is actually like an operative picture. The thing that the guy's holding up there, and let me see if this is starting to work today. Maybe. Okay, this area up in here, that area right there, that would be the area of the greater omentum. Okay, this area right in here, just to show you, that's the transverse colon right here. This is the transverse colon right here. This is part of the colon that's going up, and it's going to go, you'll see the descending colon will be over here. But this area over here that's all mixed up here is basically, that's the area of that greater omentum we talked about in the previous discussion. Okay, it's sort of like and it's actually 4 layers of peritoneum that come together, filled with fat. There's little holes in this one. I don't know why. Maybe they ripped it up or something like that. But anyway, and you can also see down inside here, if you look a little close, you can also see loops of bowel in here, loops of bowel, loops of bowel, loops of bowel, loops of bowel. Here's the colon again right here. This is the part of the ascending colon at that point. So basically, I just saw this. I thought it would be interesting to show you a little bit more as to what we actually see inside the belly. Okay, so anyway, that's a little bit about just one of the pictures that I found I thought would be interesting to show you. Let's talk about the small intestine. The small intestine is pretty long, first of all, and basically it's easily divided off into 3 sections. Well, not easily, because there's no little like a dotted line saying this is where one ends and this is where the other one starts. There are a couple of things. First portion of the small intestine is called the duodenum. The duodenum is relatively small, maybe about 12 inches, 12 inches long at max, and we'll talk about it and the importance of it in a second here. The second portion that comes after the duodenum is the jejunum. It's almost about half, 2/5 of the remaining portion of the small intestine to half of it, somewhere in that range, but that would be the jejunum. And the last portion of the small intestine is called the ileum. Okay, and there's only a couple of places where you could actually tell the difference from one to the other, and where the duodenum starts, because then that's where the pylorus, we talked about the pylorus and the pyloric sphincter in our last PowerPoint video at the end of the stomach. Then after that, it becomes the duodenum. The duodenum actually goes through an upside down V, and I'll show you what that's like. And once it gets to the upside down V, just below that, that's where the jejunum starts, even though there's not a dotted line. There's really not that much of a differentiation in regards to the tissue, what the tissue looks like. And then there's no delineation at all when something stops becoming a jejunum and starts to become an ileum. But then the next thing that we do see a definite demarcation of is when the ileum empties into the area of the large intestine at what's called the cecum, which is called the ileocecal valve. Okay, so the small intestine extends all the way from the pyloric sphincter, which is easy to see, all the way to the ileocecal valve where it dumps into the area of the colon. It's anchored to the posterior abdominal wall, like I mentioned in the last video PowerPoint, by what's called that mesentery. And that mesentery is basically, like I mentioned, where the peritoneum and the back side of the abdominal wall folds back on itself as a double layer and allows the blood vessels to be able to come up to be able to supply all the organs. And then the peritoneum then covers over all the organs. That's what we call that visceral peritoneum. Parietal peritoneum covering the inside of the abdominal wall, visceral peritoneum covering all the other tissues. And again, if we're looking here, what we're seeing in this particular image here is the small intestine starts right about, it's not where there, it starts right about there, and this is this right here would be the pylorus. Okay, the small intestine is there. You see a lot of it out. Okay, and then what happens is right here would be the area where that ileum empties into the first portion of the large intestine right here, which is called the cecum, this area right there. So that's where we're talking about in regards to the small intestine. Now this just is another image that I found that shows the difference, or shows the mesentery. If we look at this whole area in here, okay, this is all the mesentery, and that's again a double layer of peritoneum. It has some fat that's inside of it, and then what happens is we also see that this area right here is the small bowel. This area all here is the small bowel. This tube area is all the small bowel. Looks like a nice big sausage in there, but it's empty because that's where all the material, the fecal material, or the food and digested thing that are going to be absorbed are going to be inside the lumen of the area of the small bowel. But if you look really, you don't have to really look close. You see all these little lines, okay? And all these little lines lines are all the blood vessels, and that's how we get the blood supply from the aorta to the intestines, which are pretty much free moving a lot. They go through that double layer of the mesentery right between the two layers, and that's how they get there. So that's the way, because you can't have, like I say, you can have vessels just going haphazardly throughout the abdomen. They're usually aligned in parallel lines, okay? They're called vasorecta because they're very straight lines, and they come from arcades. There's a little arcade right there. You don't have to remember that, but the little arcades are little loops of blood vessels, and from that we have these little hair-like structures, which are basically the vasorecta, or the blood vessels that come out from the tops of those little arcades of blood vessels. Okay. Let's first talk about a little bit more about the division of the small intestine. The first is the duodenum. First of all, it's the shortest. It's also widest. It's probably widest because at that point things are being dumped from the stomach into the area of the duodenum. Okay, it's also what you'd have to consider the most fixed. Okay, let me get to that in a second. And right here, okay, this would be the pylorus right here. This would be the pylorus, this area right in here. So right here would be the pyloric sphincter. So they actually divide the duodenum into four parts. First portion of the duodenum, the second portion of the duodenum, the third portion of the duodenum, and the fourth portion of the duodenum. And right after that upside down V, down here, it becomes the jejunum. Okay, after that. So that's the duodenum. Again, it's very short. Okay, so it begins at the pylorus and ends at that duodenal jejunal juncture, which is just it's called the duodenal flexure, where it goes upside down. So we have four parts to it and everything like that. A couple things are interesting to point out in this particular image is that what happens is if I look at that duodenum, and let me get rid of all this garbage work here, artwork I put in here. Okay, if I look in here, this thing right in here that comes out here, it comes out with a tail, that's the pancreas. The pancreas fits in what's called the C loop, which is right here. Okay, and the pancreas, I'll get rid of the purple again. Okay, the pancreas sits right inside there. Okay, and if you look up in here, the gallbladder would be up in here. So if I look, the gallbladder would be up. Oh, it's not. Let me see if I could draw it here. Gallbladder will be sitting up in here, and it's going to come down through this duct, and the duct actually enters into the duodenum right about here. Let me do a different color. Right about here, it empties into there. Also, right up the middle of the pancreas would be the pancreatic duct, which also empties into the duodenum right there. The bile duct from the gallbladder that drains the gallbladder, comes from the liver and the gallbladder, basically helps to emulsify or liquefy fats, like we talked about before. And that pancreatic duct that comes right up the middle of the duodenum, or right up the middle of the pancreas, and empties into that second portion of the duodenum right there, that contains a number of enzymes. The insulin and the glucagon are in the blood. They get put in the blood. They don't go right into the intestine. But the enzymes like lipase and amylase get squirted through this duct that go into that area that I have circled. Okay. One other thing I wanted to mention is something that we talked about in the cardiovascular section when we were there. See this little thing right there, that little red thing? Let me get rid of that little red thing right there. That comes out over the top. It actually loops right over the top of the duodenum right there, and that's that superior mesenteric artery. And that's the one, when we looked at that vasorecta and all those vessels in that mesentery on the previous slide, that they actually came from this artery that loops over the top of the duodenum, then forms these arcades inside, and then the vasorecta come out from the arcades like that to supply the entire loop of bowel, which is actually sort of cool. Okay, so anyway, that's a little bit about the duodenum. The duodenum is really important because you got to remember what happens. The stuff that's been in the stomach with all the acids and stuff now gets dumped into the duodenum. There has to be a lot of bicarbonate and mucus in the duodenum to be able to neutralize that acid, or it burns. That's why sometimes people have both a gastric ulcer, or they may have a duodenal ulcer. And that's if there's a lot of acid material that's dumped in the duodenum and there's not enough bicarbonate, or there's not enough buffer or mucus in there to protect the duodenum. But what happens is also, you got to remember, in this duodenum, because I have a large duct that drains the gallbladder, and I have a large duct that drains the pancreas of the enzymes and stuff like that, there's a lot of digestion that's going in here. So this, even though the duodenum is only like about 9 to 12 inches long, and it's a very small C-shaped area of the first portion of the small intestine, it's exceptionally important. It's exceptionally important simply because a lot's going on in regards to digestive juices, enzymes, bile, and everything else that's going to set up for more digestion as it goes on down the intestinal tract. Okay, so it's really important. In fact, when they do bariatric surgery, what they do is they frequently again, cut off most of the stomach and then tie the stomach in way down the line. However, they leave the duodenum, they close it, they actually close the duodenum, they sew it closed up in this area, up in here, and but they still leave the duodenum intact with the rest of the intestine. They don't take the intestine out, they leave it in there. And this allows the juices to continue going down until they're able to work further on down the tract. Even though the material, if the duodenum is no longer attached to the stomach and the stomach is attached to the intestines further on down, the juices there still in that duodenum are able to still meet up with everything else further on down the road. Okay, so that's a little bit about the duodenum. And again, this just shows, and if you look, don't worry about the image on the, well, I'll tell you about the image on the right. If we look at the image on the left, this is the duodenum right here, okay, and there's that little duodenum flexure, so this will be the jejunum after here. But here's the aorta, and I brought this in because I wanted to show, here's the aorta, there's the aorta sitting right there. That right there would be the celiac trunk, and that celiac trunk gives off branches to go into the stomach, it goes to the liver, and a bunch of, here's going to the spleen and stuff like that, and that's the celiac trunk. And then right below the area of the celiac trunk, okay, like we talked about in the vascular thing before, the vascular discussion, this right here is that superior mesenteric artery. You see how it actually goes through the area of the pancreas right there and comes out right over the top of the duodenum, and that's the one that's right here that goes and supplies, here's those arcades, see all those little arcades, and all those vasa recta that are coming off directly from that. And that actually supplies, this is to the small intestine, but also the first half of the large intestine. This half is supplied by the inferior mesenteric artery, which comes down in there. Okay, so that's just a little bit about that arterial blood supply that I wanted to show you a little bit more. Again, if we look, here's that celiac trunk right there, here's the superior mesenteric artery that we talked about, and here's that inferior mesenteric artery. They don't really show very much of this of the renal arteries because it would be behind all this. Okay, so anyway, I just thought that'd be interesting to show you that. Once I get past the duodenum, I get to the jejunum and the ileum. The jejunum begins just after that upside down V, that duodenal flexure, okay? Starts right there, which is the duodenal jejunal junction. And then what happens, it continues on and ends at the ileocecal junction in the ileum, okay? It's about 6 to 7 meters long. So, I mean, we're talking, you know, a long son of a gun. If it's 7 meters, we're talking 21 feet, 6 meters, 18 feet, somewhere in that rough range. It might be a little bit longer in the cadaver than in the human, because in humans it's a little bit squinched up. It's a little, if you ever look at a cadaver, you see these tubes and they're just like flat. They're sitting in there. What happens is the small intestine is usually a little bit more bunched up, so it looks a little bit shorter because it's all sort of contracted together inside from the mesentery. The mesentery holds it close together. The jejunum is about the first 2/5 of length of the remaining after the duodenum. The ileum's the rest, but who really cares? I don't care if it's 2/5. I don't care if it's 3/6. I don't really care. It's, you know, you can't tell the difference between the one and the other. There's no little demarcating line of demarcation that says this is jejunum and this is ileum. You're now passing the jejunum and into the ileum. It's nothing like that. Okay. The terminal ileum is down in the pelvis. It's very, very low. It's in that right lower quadrant. Okay, and that's where the colon is going to start, and that's where right there there'll be a little junction or a little sphincter, which is called the ileocecal sphincter or ileocecal valve, and that allows all the material that's been in the duodenum or in the small intestine from the duodenum to the jejunum to the ileum to be spilled into the colon. Okay, and that's what happens. So but again, there's no true junction between the jejunum and ileum. Okay, now what happens in the small intestine, and this is a really important thing. Lots of stuff happens. The duodenum, very little digestion. It's probably just, or very little absorption. Still a lot of digestion going on in there because of all the bile that's secreted in there to emulsify fats, the enzymes from the pancreas, and a number of other things. So what happens is inside the small intestine they have what are called goblet cells, and these goblet cells secrete a mucus, and that mucus lines the intestine as well. Particularly very important in the duodenum because of the acidic nature. They have to sort of buffer things, and usually it's more of an alkaline mucus that's in the duodenal glands that will actually produce and the alkaline is buffering the acid of the gastric contents. Okay, we also have intestinal glands or crypts of Lieberkühn. Okay, and basically these have all kinds of other glands that will have other types of digestive enzymes along the area of the small intestine to continue digestion. Again, we can't absorb until we finally get things broken down into small enough particles where they could get through the wall of the intestine. So there's a lot of digestion that's going on, particularly in the upper portion of the small intestine. When we get to the lower portion, things are pretty much ready to be going across, okay, getting across the border into the bloodstream. But when we get to the top, it's still a lot of digestion going on, okay. And basically, these are some of the areas, just a thing that shows some of the they're called villi. Okay, and I'll mention villi in a second. And villi are like little fingers, okay? Little fingers. And what the villi do is they increase the overall surface area inside the intestine. So therefore, there's more areas that we can absorb nutrients. In other words, if I have a flat surface, there's less area to absorb nutrients. But if I take that flat surface and make it bumpy with multiple bumps, it just increases the surface area and more can be absorbed when I get further on down the road. Here down in here, you can see the little crypts. It says the intestinal glands, or the crypts of Lieberkühn down there, which basically have a lot more digestive enzymes in there. So basically, that's what we have in the wall of the small intestine. If you looked at them, they'd look nice and smooth. Actually, I can't say totally smooth. There'd be some wrinkles, but you wouldn't see these little fingers because they're very small. They're very microscopic. You don't see those little villi. Okay. And what happens also, the small intestine has, besides the villi, they also have circular folds. Okay, and I'll show you an image of what that looks like. Let me just pop up that image right now. Should be coming up, I think. Maybe not. Anyway, what happens, oh yeah, there we go. Let's try it now. That's it right there. And these little folds, okay, they're called plicae, okay, and these plicae also increase the surface area that we find inside the intestine, okay, and so if you look at a radiograph of a small intestine, what you'll see is these little small stripes going across the lumen of the small intestine, but they're very, very close, okay, and they're called plicae. And these plicae, it's like a plica. Plica means a fold, okay, and these are little folds, and they line the whole small intestine. Now, on top of the folds are villi and microvilli, okay, and these are those little fingers. And the previous, you could go back if you want and look at what was on the previous image. Inside these little fingers are two things, okay, little capillaries, little blood vessels that will go up inside these little fingers or villi, as well as something called lacteals. And lacteals are basically small lymphatic channels, okay, and they're basically more for the absorption of things like fats. Some things are absorbed through the lacteals, and they're put into the lymphatic system and then dumps it into the venous system by the jugular vein. Other things are put in the capillaries, and the capillaries then go into the inferior mesenteric vein. From the inferior mesenteric vein, it becomes a portal vein and goes into the liver, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But to increase the area, the distance or the area, the surface area to absorb material in the small intestine, we have these plicae, okay, as well as the little fingers on top of the plicae, and sometimes what's called a brush border or microvilli on top of the villi. And just, you know, we have a hill on top of a bigger hill on top of a mountain. And that's what we're talking about for the plicae to the villi to the microvilli are brush borders, okay? And that's what we're talking about looking at these little villi. If we look at this image here, you see there's a capillary that goes right up the middle, and that capillary is going to be able to absorb the things that the things have been digested enough to become small enough molecular particles. They're able to go through the wall of the intestine, okay, and then they're able to get inside the capillary, so now they can be put into the circulation, so we could use those nutrients, okay. And along with that, they always put them in green, are the little lacteals, and the lacteals are basically a lot to absorb a lot of fats and stuff like that, okay. How do I move things around through the intestine, okay? First of all, again, we know that the small intestine, as well as the large intestine, as well as the stomach and all these things, are primarily under the control of the parasympathetic nervous system. Hopefully by now that sinks in. Parasympathetic nervous system drives the GI tract, okay? And what it does is it stimulates a couple things. It stimulates the nerves to be able to cause what's called segmentation and peristalsis. If you look at the intestine, it's not a straight shot. It goes up and loops around, and you know, it's a lot of these little hairpin turns that go around. And that way it does, it divides things, okay? So the material gets segmented by various loops, as well as the peristalsis. Now, the peristalsis we talked about, this is a critical factor. The peristalsis is the muscular activity in that muscular wall, like we talked about. You know, we have a mucosa, we have a glandular wall, we have a muscular wall, then we have an outer wall. And that muscular wall squeezes, so it actually squeezes the stuff and sort of milks things along the track. It sort of moves things along. When you're sitting there and you feel your stomach and your intestines growl, that's the peristalsis moving things around, okay? So we get a lot of that moving the material through this peristalsis. But we also, where the stomach had a lot of churning, because things are segmented, in other words, in small little loops of the bowel, okay, then what happens is that also helps to break things down even further. Also in the small intestine, like I mentioned before, there's also further enzymatic degradation of carbohydrates and monosaccharides, sugars, and stuff like that that are occurring. So we still have digestion occurring through a good portion of the small intestine, more in the upper portion than in the lower portion, and also further enzymatic degradation of protein peptides into amino acids. The stomach does a nice job in starting to rip up the protein into polypeptides. However, you know, it's still not quite finished product. We have to do it a little bit more. And some of the proteolytic breakdown, proteolytic enzymes in the GI tract will help to further break down the peptides into amino acids, because the amino acids are going to be smaller molecular structures that could get across the wall. Okay, so that happens. So we're having further digestion that's occurring in the small intestine. Just a little bit about intestinal absorption. What I think I want you to remember is not everything is absorbed the same way. When we talked about the pulmonary system, when I talked about oxygen and carbon dioxide, most of the movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide across the capillary and alveolar membrane and stuff like that was by simple diffusion. Simple diffusion, concentration being greater on one side, less on the other side, you go from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. But things like, you know, glucose, monosaccharides, amino acids, fatty acids are small enough now after that digestion to be able to get through the wall of the intestine. However, not all of them go through the same way. We have a number of different ways that we could get things through the wall of the small intestine and into those capillaries and lacteals that are inside those little villi. Okay, some of it's by diffusion, again, just by concentration. Some of it's facilitated by diffusion, where it might be picked up by a carrier. Some of it's by osmosis, which is going to be a little bit by water, and then some of it's by active transport. Okay, so these are things that the ways that we could get things across. Now, I'm going to show you a slide in a minute. You're going to get all freaked out. You can say, "Oh my gosh, I got to remember." Don't remember all that. Okay, but what happens is through one of a number of methods, whether it be diffusion, facilitated diffusion, osmosis, or active transport, what happens is we find that we need to get the nutrients in those little blood vessels, those little capillaries in the villi or the lacteals. And once we get in there, blood vessels pick up larger fatty acids and monoglycerides that combine them and do all kinds of stuff. And eventually what happens, things get routed to the liver, okay? And they get routed to the liver through the portal vein, and we'll talk about that as well. Or if they're into the lacteals, now the lacteals don't go because it's part of the lymphatic system. The lacteals actually drain into what's called the thoracic duct. On the back of the wall of the abdomen, and most people probably wouldn't know this, but lymphatic structures, we have little lymph vessels. And I'll be truthful with you, of the number of times I've cut legs and arms and stuff like that, I have never really found a lymph vessel at all. There's some way that we actually have these little channels that are able to transport lymph, which is another fluidy material, and it's helping to drain infections and drains tissue fluid, all kinds of stuff like that. And what happens, these channels will drain, but the only time you start to see where they're draining to is sometimes in the abdomen. And what happens in the abdomen, you see things that looks like a tube that has lumps and bumps on it. It's sort of like there's little bubbles on the tube and stuff like that all the way, and that's called the thoracic duct. It goes from the abdomen all the way up to the area and dumps into the venous circulation. So certain things such as certain fats and stuff like that that are absorbed into the lacteals get dumped into the lymphatic circulation and then put into the venous circulation, but not in the typical way. Other things that get into the vessels actually get dumped into the superior mesenteric vein, and the superior mesenteric vein joins with the splenic vein that becomes the portal vein, and that goes to the liver for dissemination. Okay, and then the liver takes it and puts it through hepatic veins into the inferior vena cava to drain it, go back to the right side of the heart, and then the right side of the heart to the left side of the heart, and the left side then distributes those nutrients to the rest of the body. Okay, so that's a little about that. Again, Oh, I'm stopping again. This is not good. There we go. Okay. Now you're freaked out. Okay, looking at it, and say, holy cow. I just want to show this. What happens is things are transported by different ways. Okay, and that's all you need. Do not memorize this slide. I think you should remember that diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and active transport are probably the biggest ways I get things across that membrane that go from the area of the gut through that brush border, which you'd see the brush border there, the little wavy thing, okay, through the cell and into either a capillary of a villus or to the lacteals, which is on the bottom, which is basically my triglycerides, my fats end up in the lacteals, as compared to things such as some other fatty acids will go into the circulatory system by the capillaries, dipeptides, tripeptides, which are basically proteins, amino acids that further break down fructose, glucose, starches and stuff like that. Some of it's by diffusion, some of it's by facilitated diffusion, some of it's by active transport. That's all I need to remember. Not particularly anything. Again, we know that now once we get to the absorption, what really controls the absorption in the small intestine? Again, it's neural and hormonal control. Neural, we know, is always parasympathetic. That's going to stimulate the process. Is going to allow secretion of materials that will assist in the further breakdown so things could be absorbed, as well as hormonally. There's something called a vasoactive intestinal peptide, don't remember that increases intestinal secretion, that helps to get the stuff ready. In other words, when you getting ready to go to work or something like that, once we're out of the house and around, obviously you don't leave the house in just your undies and your shoes and socks. You have to get dressed. So what happens is the hormonal parasympathetic activity that causes secretion of further things will sort of facilitate in the final breakdown of things so they could get absorbed through the wall of the small intestine. Okay, and again, motility is mostly because of the presence of chyme. And chyme, we talked about, is the material that's ejected from the stomach into the small intestine. Once I get that stuff into the small intestine, that's enough of a stimulus to make all the processes to further digestion and then finally absorption occur. Okay. Now, I mentioned a couple minutes ago the portal vein, and again, the portal vein is one of these veins that gets no respect, and it needs all the respect in the world. Because we talked how easy it is to figure out how oxygen gets into the bloodstream and how we get rid of carbon dioxide. That's a piece of cake. Lungs and tissues, and that's about it. But what happens is nutrients are different matter. Nutrients are totally different. So we eat this stuff, we get it broken down, and the stuff that is actually absorbed into our circulatory system through the capillaries in those little villi and microvilli along the brush border, okay, the things that do get into the circulatory system, they have to be transported around the body. Well, obviously what happens is the capillaries lead to venules, venules lead to veins. And that happens here. When we get to the kidneys, I'm going to blow your mind because it's a little bit different, okay? So what happens is these capillaries are going to go to venules, and venules are going to go to veins. So all the nutrients that we absorb in our GI tract, okay, don't get into the arteries yet. They have to get to the arteries via veins. So what happens is the intestine is drained by a large vein called the superior mesenteric vein. Okay, the majority of the small intestine and the first half of the large intestine, where most of this absorption is going to occur, gets into the superior mesenteric vein. Now, the superior mesenteric vein, think about it. It's low in oxygen content, but high in nutrients. And that's a key factor. High in nutrients, low in oxygen. Why? Because it's come from the body. It's going to mix with all the other the oxygen has been taken out of it in the arterial side, and so as a result, now it has lower oxygen but has high nutrients. And what happens is that superior mesenteric vein, which drains all the nutrients that have gotten into the capillaries in the little villi, it goes into the superior mesenteric vein. The superior mesenteric vein leaves and it meets with another vein that comes across from the spleen called the splenic vein. Okay. The splenic vein, then the superior mesenteric vein join to form one large vein, which is called the portal vein. Okay, so the portal vein basically delivers the nutrients that have been absorbed in the small intestine and in some of the large intestine, which not many in the large intestine, delivers them to the liver for first utilization. The liver gets first choice of everything that the intestine absorbs. Now, this is important. Think about it. Number one, let's say medications. I mentioned this in a previous, I think in another talk. Medications, when you take them, they have to be absorbed. They get into the circulation, but how they get in the circulation? They get absorbed through the intestinal wall. Okay, some things, very few things like aspirin, maybe through the stomach, but other things through the intestinal wall. Then they get into the blood vessels, and the first place to go is to the liver. Most medications, or many of the medications we take, are inactive. They go to the liver, and the liver processes these medications before they put them out in the circulation. They process them, and when they process them, they convert them from being inactive medications to active medications, and they say, okay, you're ready, you're out the door. Okay, so they send them out. Okay, and as a result, now those medications become active. Things such as albumin. Albumin, we talked about a couple times, is important protein to keep the fluid in vessels. Okay, it's a protein, and who makes albumin, do you think? Oh, right, the liver. What are proteins made of? Oh, right, amino acids. So the amino acids that are absorbed will go to the liver, and the liver is able to, by its recipe from DNA, make the albumin to put back in the circulation. Important. Now the spleen has a little bit of a contribution, because what happens, we talked about this before, the spleen gets dead and dying red blood cells. When the red blood cell gets to a certain age, 100, 120 days, it's no longer very much useful. So what the spleen does, it gathers it up and starts to break them up. It takes the iron from the red blood cell, from the hemoglobin in the red blood cell, and puts it back in the circulation so I could reuse the iron. But it takes the protein part of the hemoglobin, because hemoglobin is a protein with iron molecules on it to be able to bind with the oxygen. It takes the protein part of the hemoglobin and slices it up, and then it sends it to the liver. Guess what the liver does? The liver makes a particular material called bilirubin from the broken down red blood cells. It makes bilirubin. Well, the bilirubin is a brownish yellow pigment. When the bilirubin levels build up in the body because of a problem with the liver, a problem with whatever the case may be, what happens, that's when we start to see the jaundice, the yellowing in the eyes and the skin, because this brownish yellow pigment gets deposited in the skin. Okay. Also, the bilirubin then gets converted, added cholesterol and a couple other things, and that's what we have that forms bile. The bile then is transmitted down these tubes from the liver and back up into the gallbladder, stored in the gallbladder, so when somebody has a fatty meal, the gallbladder squeezes the bile down into the duodenum, because we know that gallbladder empties into the duodenum, and what it does is at that point it starts to break up fats. It emulsifies it or liquefies it. So basically this portal vein is exceptionally important, is really important. Okay, so it delivers the nutrients directly to the liver first for first utilization for whatever the liver needs to do. Liver also makes things like clotting factors. If the liver's not functioning, we have a difficult time clotting. That's why people who have liver failure usually get large bruised areas all over their body, because they don't clot very well. Certain vitamins are made in the liver. Okay, so, and also the medications, like I say, are activated in the liver so they could be used for the rest of the body. So this portal vein is exceptionally important. It goes to the liver. Okay, and this just gives you a little idea about the portal vein. Let me just draw you a little picture. Okay, I'll try to get you an idea. This right here, whoops, where'd it go? Okay, this area right here, that's the superior mesenteric vein. This vein right here is the splenic vein, and when the two of those come together, they form this thing right here, which is the portal vein, and the portal vein fills this area right in here, which is the liver. The liver has what I call sinusoids, which they just dump a lot of blood into. The liver is a very bloody organ, large open areas, and then the liver takes out what it needs from the sinusoids. Then what happens is once the liver takes what it needs in these little sinusoids, it deposits it through here, through the hepatic vein, into the inferior vena cava. Inferior vena cava is going to the right side of the heart, goes to the left side of the heart, and then now from the left side of the heart it can deliver all the rest of the nutrients that can be used to somewhere else. So that's the superior mesenteric vein and the splenic vein that become the portal vein. Exceptionally important. I've probably spent 10 minutes talking about the portal vein, which is probably 9 minutes more than most other people hear about the portal vein. It's that important. I could probably sit here and talk about the portal vein and some other problems that happen with the portal vein, but we don't really have time for that, and you're probably bored stiff about the portal vein. Say, well, let's get off the portal vein. So let's get off the portal vein. Okay. Let's say now what happens is now we've absorbed most of the nutrients in the small intestine. We get to the large intestine, okay? And the large intestine has a couple jobs, okay? There's one big job I'll talk about in a second. But what happens to the large intestine, like the small intestine, is divided into different sections. That first area where the small intestine, where the ileum, because we go duodenum, jejunum, ileum, where that duodenum or that ileum is deposits and goes through this little valve or this little sphincter, the ileocecal sphincter, drops into what's called the cecum. Now the cecum is like a little, like blind pouch where the colon first starts. It sits down there, and it's basically down in that right lower quadrant, which everybody should know. And at the bottom of the cecum, there's a little hollow tube that comes from the bottom of the cecum, and that's the appendix. I'll show you exactly where that is. What happens is then from that cecum, where everything sort of like drops into, all of a sudden, because of peristalsis that occurs in the colon, it starts to squish the material up. Has to go upwards, and that's what we call the ascending colon, because now the colon's going upward. Once I get there, just below the area of the liver, it makes a turn. It makes a left-hand turn. It's going from right to left, okay, because the liver's on the right side, we know. It makes a turn from right to left, and it goes to what's called the transverse colon. And transverse means it's going from the right side to the left side. Finally, it gets to what's called the descending colon, which is going down to my left lower quadrant. Now what happens is now I've made this big U-shaped area of the colon, okay? I'm getting down my left lower quadrant. Well, most people that I know, their anus is in the midline, okay? In fact, I'd say probably everybody, although I don't check. What happens, I know it has to be in the midline. How do I get from the left lower quadrant to the midline? What happens is the colon then goes through an S-shaped curve, which is called the sigmoid colon. So it's an S-shape. Sigma, Greek letter sigma is like a little S-shaped little wiggle, okay? So it goes to the sigmoid colon, which then gets everything in the middle, and then it ends up with another pouch in there, which is called the rectum. The rectum is basically for storing formed fecal material. We keep it in the rectum until you're ready to eliminate. Then you have the anal canal and the anus, which basically has sphincters, so you could hold fecal material until you're ready to go, okay? And to ready to relieve that. We also know that as the small intestine was held to the posterior abdominal wall by the mesentery, what happens is we know that the colon is held to the back of the posterior abdominal wall by what's called the mesocolon. So it's also a band of mesentery or a band of peritoneum, double band that comes over and wraps around the colon all over the place, okay? And that's called the mesocolon, because meso means mesentery, and mesocolon, colon means colon. Okay, so if I'm looking at the colon, this is what we see here. So if I'm looking at that image, okay, that colon is starting down in here, and this area right here, the little blind pouch, let me get that out of there so you can see a little bit better. Okay, let me see if I can do it this way. The little blind pouch down here is the cecum, and then right here would be the area where the appendix hangs down. Actually, if they go in with a colonoscopy, you get to see the hole for where the appendix is. And then what happens is things that don't get digested, like seeds, husks, nuts, and stuff like that, get jammed down inside that hole and causes an inflammation, and that's what causes the appendicitis, because then the bacteria go crazy. Once I leave the cecum, which is here, and you can actually see right here is that ileocecal valve coming right down here, okay? I go up my ascending colon, okay, which is fixed to the posterior abdominal wall, okay? It's really tight. I go across my transverse colon, which is right here. And if you remember that omentum, that greater omentum, was hung from the front side of that transverse colon. And the transverse colon is very movable. It can move a lot. Then I go from my transverse colon to the descending colon down here. That descending colon then goes to this S-shaped curve right here, which is my sigmoid colon, into the area of the rectum and then out the anal canal. Okay, and basically that's what we have in regards to the anatomical structure of the colon. Okay, this is just another picture looking at probably a little bit better picture of everything else out. We've gotten all the other material. This is the cecum right here. This is the opening where the ileocecal valve would be. Here's the ileum right here. Here's the ileum. This is the ileum right here. So this is a cecum. So you think pop in here. The appendix is sitting down here. Okay. And then I go from the ileum to my ascending colon, which would be this area right here, to my transverse colon, which is this area in here. Let me do a different color on it so it's a little darker. My transverse colon right here, to my descending colon in here, to my sigmoid colon, to the rectum, to the anal canal down in there. Okay. Now there are a couple things on the colon that I'll talk about in just a second. I mentioned that the small intestine looks very tubular, but it has little kinks all over the place, and the inside has all these plica, all these little closely, it's like accordion bands that are very close. The large intestine, the colon, is similar, but if you look here, they have larger pouches. These these pouches are actually quite large, and I'll show you an X-ray. They'll show, and these are called haustral pouches. Haustral pouches are haustra. See the word right here, haustra, and what they are is along the duration of the colon, there's little muscles, and let me see if I can see it here in this picture here. Let me get rid of this. Yeah, you can see right here. There are 3 little muscle bands right in here. Okay, it runs all the way, and what happens, these muscle bands tighten up, so it actually creates this pouch-like appearance, almost like you take a hem of a pair of pants and you pull the string and it makes it tighter and bunches it up, and that's what happens with these haustral pouches. Okay, that's why it's there, and these little muscles are called tenae colae, and you can see right here, here's the, what says tenae right here, is the tenae right there, and tenae right there. And so you can see what they're called, tenae. Tenae means, you know, whatever, and colae means colon. Okay, so that's where they get the name. This is actually looking, I put this in here, and you're saying, now what in the world is this? You know, I don't know what this is. This right here is the ileum. That's the ileum. Okay, and then right here is the area of the ileocecal valve. So this right here would be the cecum. Right here, and if you look really close, there's our little friend, the appendix, sitting right down in there. So I just thought that was an interesting picture. You can see what's this right here. That's part of that mesentery, and you can see the vessels. They're going. Okay, perfect. Okay, so anyway, we've talked about that. That should be pretty well self-explanatory for you. Okay, the large intestine, like I say, has these tenae colae, which are ribbon. There's like three bands, okay, and they run longitudinally along the whole colon, and they pull it together and they contract, and that's what causes those haustral pouches, like I talked about before. Haustra, H-A-U-S-T-R-A, or haustral pouches. Okay, and you can see them here. This actually shows that the tenae colae, these little bands, like in here and here and here, and by contracting a little bit, they sort of make all the little pouches on there, and these are much bigger, which means that when you look at an X-ray, you're able to see the difference between a large colon, you know, or large intestine colon versus the small intestine. They look much different on the X-ray. Okay, now this is a picture looking at the colon. I like this. This is pretty good. Okay, and if you look here, see all these bulges? See all the bulges? Those are the haustra. Those are the haustra. This area right in here is the transverse colon. Okay, here's the ascending colon. Here's the descending colon. You can't see much of the sigmoid. You can see the rectum down here. There's the cecum. You can see right there. Okay, this in here, and look at the difference. See how these have all these big bulges? This area in here, that's all a bunch of small intestine, and right here is that ileocecal valve right there. So let me erase that so you can see. Okay, whoops. Oh man, I shouldn't have done that. Okay. Anyway, I went ahead too far. I don't know what happened. Okay, it won't, and again, won't let me go back. A couple things about the large intestine that I should mention, besides how it's these haustral pouches. The majority of the work in regards to absorption has already been done in the small intestine. The small intestine basically does most of it. Okay, what really is the most important thing for the large intestine is it absorbs water. It absorbs water, okay? And so what happens is by the time the material gets down to the end of the small intestine in the ileum and squirts itself into the colon at the ileocecal valve and into the cecum to go up the ascending colon, it's still liquid. It's still soup, okay? It looks like diarrhea, it smells like diarrhea, and basically, truthfully, it is diarrhea. So what happens is we want to get rid of all that water. So about 90% of the water that's in there, or much more, is actually absorbed from the area, from the fecal material that's at the beginning of the cecum, as it goes through the ascending, the transverse colon, and the descending colon. So the largest job of the colon is to be able to absorb the water. That's its biggest thing. Some other things might be also done. There are certain bacteria that stay, and I think it's probably in the previous slide, certain bacteria that we have throughout the throughout the GI system, and they assist in digestion. But there's some bacteria in the colon that actually help to make certain other vitamins. So we're actually able to take whatever is left of this material and sometimes make vitamins and put it back in the circulation. But the biggest thing, I think, the thing you should probably remember, the most important thing that the colon does is to take the water out of the fecal material, so that what happens is it results in more formed stools or feces, so that what happens is not always dripping and watery and wet and stuff like that, but more bulky and more formed. And that's the biggest purpose of the large intestine, is to remove the water. Again, make some vitamins and stuff like that in there from the bacteria that are in the colon. And again, this is sort of interesting too. The bacteria, what's called the bacterial flora. You know, like if you have a flower bed, you have a bunch of different flowers in there. The flora, different types of flowers. So we have all kinds of different bacteria inside the gut, inside the small intestine, inside the stomach. And stomach is actually interesting because some of the acid will destroy some of it. But when I get into the small intestine and the colon, there's still a lot of bacteria in there, okay? And this bacteria actually creates a sort of a nice harmonious atmosphere between the bacteria. Sometimes when people, and this is something that you may have heard of, certain antibiotics that people will take, what they sometimes do is they wipe out the normal flora, the normal bacteria that are growing in the colon, and they let some other bacteria that are there that are opportunistic. These other bacteria are there, but they're in a very small amount, and the other ones say, you stay in your corner, you don't come out, stay there, I don't want to, you could be seen but not heard, sit down, shut up, that type of thing. They sort of keep them sequestered. However, if the bacteria, the other normal flora that normally does things in the colon and the small intestine are eliminated because they're killed off by taking an antibiotic for some type of infection, these ones that were in the corner says, hey, you know what? They're away. I think it's time for a party. And they come out and they start to go crazy and they start to proliferate, make more. And this is where you heard the term C. difficile. When you hear a C. difficile, this was the problem. And people were, people take an antibiotic and then develop explosive diarrhea. And when they got the explosive diarrhea, frequently they become significantly dehydrated and may die. Okay, and you'll also see this in certain situations where sometimes, now if you see like at fairs and stuff like that, where they bring in water, they bring in the big things of containers of water, the big potable water, they bring that all in. And what happens is sometimes they're contaminated with certain strains of E. coli. And the E. coli sort of like is at odds with a lot of the other bacteria that are in there. Okay, there are some strains of E. coli, but these are very strong and they're very unusual, and they can't be. And some of them now are very difficult to be able to get killed by antibiotics. Okay, and sometimes so they drink the E. coli, and the E. coli says, hey, you know what? We're going to cause havoc down the drain. And what happens is it turns out that then you find some kids that die. Because what happens is the E. coli strain takes over the inside bacterial flora and controls things. It just sort of comes in, takes over the area, and the kids have explosive diarrhea and become dehydrated and will die. Okay, when they get dehydrated, it takes the fluid out of their circulatory system. Therefore, there's not enough blood pressure to be able to run things, and they may die from shock. Okay, and shock means that the blood pressure crashes, it's down. Okay, so that's a little about the large intestinal physiology. Let me just show you, in tying this up here, a little bit about some of the x-rays, because x-rays are important things that you're going to be looking at. Now, I brought this in for this picture here for a couple special reasons. Okay, the first reason I brought in because there was one muscle that was on your muscle list that I never showed you because it was sort of a hard place to show. Okay, and that's this muscle right here. See this little tent that forms right there? That muscle right there is called the psoas. That's the psoas muscle. Normally we should see it. Okay, when they get an abdominal x-ray, you see that. Let me erase it. You'll see it's like a very faint shadow, so it's a little bit grayer following along that shadow there on both sides. You see it? Looks like a little tent, a little teepee back there. Okay, and that's important to see. The reason why it's important to see is if there's extra fluid or something else like fluid or pus or something like that in the abdomen, when they lie a person down flat, they do what's called a flat plate. You lie flat and you take an x-ray. You put the x-ray film behind them. You take an x-ray down from their stomach, from the anterior to posterior, okay? And you take it through the abdomen. What happens is the fluid falls to the back. okay? And the fluid sits around that psoas muscle because the psoas muscle is on the posterior abdominal wall. It's part of a lower back muscle. It joins with the muscle that's inside the iliac crest, okay? The iliac crest, here's the iliac crest here, which you should all know. It joins with a muscle in here, and the psoas joins, it comes down in this area, it's called the iliopsoas. Iliacus plus psoas, iliopsoas. But anyway, what happens when the fluid sits down in here in the back of the abdomen when they lie flat, all of a sudden you lose that psoas shadow. You can't see it. So in other words, when they lose that psoas shadow, it might be indicative that there's other fluid or other garbage that's inside the abdomen. So that's what they always look at. They look for, can you see a psoas shadow? If you get an x-ray down the road, they say, I don't see a psoas shadow of somebody with abdominal pain, then you're starting to wonder if there's other things like pus or other fluid that's inside the abdomen. A couple things you see here, you see all these let me do it here this way. See those little opener, all those little areas are pieces of gas. Little gas inside there. And we talked about segmentation. Segmentation is how what happens is the material that's in the small intestine largely gets separated from others and separated by a little bit of gas. And that's what we see there. You can see the liver up here has a pretty homogeneous shadow here. It says spleen, but you really can't see much of the spleen right there. That's a splenic flexure, hard to tell. Now this is another one, and this is also maybe a little bit easier to see. So what happens is you're actually seeing part of the large intestine over here. So this is actually part of the ascending colon and part of the descending colon over here that's still filled with gas. Most of this stuff in here, that's all small intestine still, okay? Now this one is very interesting, okay? This is an abdominal picture that you'll never forget, okay? I'll show you another one that'll come right up after that. What happens is, this brings back a concept we talked about in the osteology section. It actually was an extra credit question just before spring break. One of the extra credit questions was I asked you what the structure was and why there was a straight line across it. And that structure was the maxillary sinus. Why was there a straight line across it? Because let's take this one right here. See that straight line right there? If you look here, it's dark. If you look below it, it's white. Here's another one. Dark, white, straight line, straight line, straight line, straight line. If you ever see anything like that, that's an intestinal obstruction. And what happens is intestinal obstruction, the gut stops working. The muscular supply to the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, gets shut off. And therefore, if the parasympathetic nervous system gets shut off, what happens? No peristalsis. No peristalsis. If there's no peristalsis, things don't move. What happens then is when they actually put someone upright, so in other words, this is an x-ray that they have them sitting upright, okay? What's going to happen? Fluid falls, air rises. And what happens is this dark area up in here is air. This area down here that's white is fluid. And when you see this on an x-ray, down the future, and when you see this, I'll probably be dead and gone. But here's what I want you to say. Air fluid levels. Air fluid levels. Air fluid levels. You heard that here first. And basically that's a sign of intestinal obstruction. Okay? The peristalsis from the parasympathetic nervous system has stopped. It's no longer going. Okay, there's enough of an insult or problem with the belly that it stops. Everything stops, and that's called, the word for that is ileus. I don't know if it's going to write it. I-L-E-U-S. I-L-E-U-S. Not ilium, but ileus. If you remember ilium and add an S on and take off the M and put an S on there, ileus means that the small bowel is no longer working. The muscles aren't working, and it's paralyzed. It doesn't work at all, and that causes these air fluid levels to. Okay, this is another one. This is very characteristic here. See the little air fluid level, air fluid level, air fluid levels? This whole abdomen is filled, and all those little air fluid levels are little areas where loops of bowel. And so what will happen is where the bowel comes up like this, it's going to turn around this way. Fluid fills down here, and air goes up in here. So air's up in here, fluid's down here, and as a result, you see that air fluid level, typical of bowel obstruction. So if you see that, you know, I see that, it looks like a bowel, it looks like another bowel obstruction. How do you know? I see air fluid levels. Don't you see the air fluid levels, stupid? Anyway, that's what you see there, okay? So those are air fluid levels, and that's intestinal obstruction. This is a barium enema, okay? And a barium enema, what they've done is they've actually put barium, which is a radioactive material into there, but it's dense, so it stops the X-rays. Okay, it's like having metal in there. It's dense. It's a real heavy stuff. And actually, I put this in there because here is my ascending colon. Here's the transverse colon. See how it kinks down there? That's because that transverse colon is very mobile. Here's my descending colon. Here's the sigmoid colon right here, and this down here would be the rectum. But I brought this. You see those? What are those? Those are the haustra. Those are the haustral pouches. And sometimes it looks like there's a line. See that? See how it looks like there's a line right here? Right where I'm going to draw it again. I'm going to erase it. See that little line right there? Let's erase it. See how it's a white line? That's because the barium lines the wall, but we've actually started to move the barium. If you look at the column on this side, if you look at the column on this side, it's very white. If you look over here, I have white, but I also have some darker area. That's because the barium has now come this way. It's being eliminated. As a result, the white lines you see there is where the barium stuck to the wall, but we still have other material and gas that's moving the barium on through. So, but you could see where that would be an image of the colon in a barium enema. Okay, and this is interesting also here. This is also the colon, and a couple things I want to show you. See that little pouch right there, and there's a little pouch right there, and there's a little pouch right there, and there's probably a little one there, a little one there, a little one there, a little one there. That's called a diverticulum. Okay, and a diverticulum is a little pouch that comes off the intestine. They could occur anywhere. They could occur in the duodenum. I have one in the duodenum when they did an upper GI, or when they did a esophageal gastroduodenoscopy on me. They could see one there. They cleaned it out a little bit. But what happens is material gets caught in there, and this gets stuck with seeds and berries and nuts and husks and stuff like that. And sometimes they become infected, and that would be called what we call a diverticulitis. Okay, so the fact that they have these little pouches is called diverticulosis, and because the diverticulosis from a diverticulum, which is the pouch, and if that pouch becomes inflamed, it's called diverticulitis. Okay, so that's all about diverticulum. So what I wanted to talk about in this basically was what the intestines do. The stomach starts the digestion, but once we get into the intestine continues it. It has to take and do the finished project. It's sort of like starting and doing half the project and not completely done in the stomach. The stomach gets a good head start, gets a running start, and then turns it over to the small intestine, and particularly the proximal portion of the small intestine, where it's going to start to continue on with more digestion. And the process with digestion is to make something in small enough particles that could get through the wall of the intestine, and that's the purpose. Okay. Finally, when I get further on down the line, I start to get that absorption, and that absorption means that now the particles of the food that I ate are now molecular size and small enough that they could get through the wall of the intestine. They go through the wall, they get into those, they through these little villi, which increase the surface area, and they get entrapped in one of two places. They either get inside the capillaries that are inside those little villi, or they get caught in these little lacteals. If it's lacteals, it goes to the lymphatic system, that gets dumped into the venous system up in the neck, or if it's into the circulatory system, it drains into the superior mesenteric vein, which joins with the splenic vein to become the portal vein, and that portal vein goes into the liver. Therefore, the liver takes care of it first, has the first choice of everything, all the nutrients that come to it to make the albumin, clotting factors, everything, activate medications, blah blah blah, and the beat goes on. And then finally, it takes whatever's left, with still a lot of nutrients, it's still nutrient rich, puts it through the hepatic vein into the area of the inferior vena cava. Inferior vena cava, as we know, or you should know, or you better know, or you have to know, goes to the right side of the heart to take the deoxygenated blood to the lungs for oxygenation. Well, the nutrients are there for the ride. You know, they're not going to do much else. And finally, it goes to the left side of the heart, and the left side of the heart takes now the oxygen-rich blood as well as the nutrient-rich blood and spreads it throughout the whole body. And that's the purpose, okay? Finally, I know I still have stuff left, still the stuff that you didn't want to use. It's sort of like weeding through stuff, and you say, yep, I'll take that. Nope, I don't want that. Yep, I want that. Nope, I don't want that. Yep, I want that. Nope, I don't want that. And you finally get the rest of the stuff that you're not going to absorb. Okay, and you say, let's just get rid of it, and basically that gets formed together in all the waste material. Things we don't get rid of wastes that are in the bloodstream into the intestines. The stuff that comes out the south end is basically the stuff that we didn't digest, that we didn't absorb, and was the waste of that. Okay, Then the colon is really important. The large intestine is important for taking most of the fluid, most of the water out of that material so you can have formed stools. And the reason why, it also helps to conserve water balance in the body. It helps me to make sure that I have enough fluid in my body to be able to keep my blood circulation, enough blood in the circulatory system to fill the vessels and stuff like that. So that's what this GI system does. And hopefully now you have a little bit better idea in regards to the whole process of what happens. And I'll talk to you in the next little talk about what the liver does a little bit more, as well as what the pancreas does a little bit more, and some of these ancillary organs. And we'll go from there. Okay? I'll see you a little bit later.